There's a moment, and you've had it, where you knew the right move. You knew you should wait. You knew the smarter play was patience. You knew that what you were about to do would cost you more than it would give you. And you did it anyway. Not because you're weak, not because you lack discipline, but because your brain, your actual biological electrochemical brain, was running a program you didn't write, didn't choose, and almost certainly don't know exists. That program has a name. Neuroscientists call it the delayed gratification circuitry. And depending on how yours is calibrated right now, it is either quietly building your future or silently dismantling it. One decision at a time, one impulse at a time, one just this once at a time. Here's what almost no one tells you. The difference between the person who accumulates wealth over a lifetime and the person who earns the same income but ends up with nothing. It is not intelligence. It is not opportunity. It is not even discipline in the way you've been taught to think about it. It is a specific neural architecture, a measurable pattern of activation between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. A wiring configuration that either allows the future self to vote in present decisions or silences it completely. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This circuitry is not fixed, but it is deeply conditioned. And most of the conditioning happened before you had any say in the matter. Stay with me through this, because what follows is not motivation, it's not a framework, it's not a system with 5 steps and a free PDF. What I'm about to walk you through is the actual neuroscience of why certain people build and others spend, and how the line between the two is drawn not in bank accounts, but in the brain. We're going to open 3 doors in this conversation. The first, what delayed gratification actually is at the neural level, not the marshmallow test version you heard in college, but the real mechanism that governs every financial decision you make. The second, the error. The one cognitive pattern that masquerades as ambition, as self-reward, as living in the present, and quietly destroys long-term accumulation while you're congratulating yourself. And the third, the blueprint. The specific neurologically grounded recalibration that changes not just your behavior, but your identity as a builder. Here's your first data point, and hold on to this. A 2019 study from the University of Pennsylvania tracked neural activity in individuals during intertemporal choice tasks. What they found wasn't willpower. What they found was a ratio. The ratio of activation between the ventral striatum, the brain's reward anticipation engine, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the seat of future self-simulation. The people who consistently chose delayed rewards didn't have more discipline. They had stronger, faster communication between those two regions. Their brains weren't resisting pleasure. They were simulating the future with enough resolution that the future felt real. And that changes everything. Because you can't resist something you can see clearly. You can only choose between 2 things you can see. And most people, most high-achieving, intelligent, driven people, are making every financial decision with one eye open. The circuitry that should be showing them the future is either underdeveloped, chronically suppressed, or hijacked by the very habits they built in the name of success. We'll get to exactly why that happens. But first, you need to understand what's actually firing in your brain the moment you encounter a financial choice. What's happening at the electrochemical level in the seconds before you decide. Because what you think is happening and what's actually happening are almost certainly 2 different things. And the gap between those 2 things, that gap has a cost. A real, compounding, decades-long cost that no one put a number on for you. Until now. In the 3 seconds before you make a financial decision, your brain does something remarkable. It runs a silent auction. On one side, the limbic system. Ancient, fast, wired for immediate survival. It doesn't think in years or decades. It thinks in now. And it bids hard. On the other side, the prefrontal cortex, slower, more deliberate, capable of modeling the future, simulating consequences, and representing a version of you that doesn't yet exist. It also bids, but it takes longer to load. The auction closes before the slower bidder finishes speaking. This is not metaphor. This is the actual sequencing of neural activation that researchers at Caltech and the University of Cambridge mapped using fMRI imaging during real financial decision tasks. The limbic response, specifically the ventral striatum, fires first, faster, and with greater initial intensity than the prefrontal response. In most people, most of the time, the first bid wins. What you experience as a decision is often just the echo of a process that already concluded. And here's what makes this particularly relevant for high achievers. For people in this audience specifically, the more stressed you are, the more cognitively loaded you are, the more your prefrontal cortex is already occupied with running your business, managing your team, solving your problems, the wider that gap becomes. The limbic system doesn't get tired. The prefrontal cortex does. This is why brilliant people make financially impulsive decisions at night, under pressure, after long weeks, not because their intelligence disappears, but because the neural region responsible for future self-simulation is running on fumes while the reward circuitry is fully charged. Think about the last time you made a purchase you later regretted, not a small one, a real one. Where were you in that moment? What had the day looked like? The research is consistent. Cognitive depletion increases temporal discounting, which is the technical term for what happens when the future shrinks in your brain. When next year starts to feel like a vague abstraction, and right now feels loud, specific, and urgent. Temporal discounting is not a flaw, it's a feature. A survival feature from a time when the future was genuinely uncertain and the present was genuinely dangerous. Your ancestors who waited, who delayed, often didn't survive to pass on those genes. The ones who grabbed what was in front of them? They did. But you are not your ancestor. And the threats are different now. The problem is that the brain hasn't fully updated the software, and what once kept a human alive on a savanna is now quietly draining a retirement account in a suburb of Atlanta. Here's what the phenomenon looks like in practice. And you may recognize this. A person earns well, genuinely well. They are not irresponsible. They are not reckless. But every time a surplus appears, something happens. A purchase, an upgrade, a justification that sounds completely rational in the moment. I worked for this. I deserve this. The market is uncertain anyway. And the surplus disappears. Not in one dramatic collapse, in dozens of small, reasonable-sounding decisions, each one losing the auction before the prefrontal cortex could finish its sentence. This is the phenomenon. Not weakness, not laziness. A timing problem inside a 3-pound organ that's running legacy code. And the reason it matters, the reason it's worth your full attention right now, is that this timing problem is not random. It is systematic. It runs the same way, in the same sequence, for nearly everyone, which means it can be mapped. And anything that can be mapped can be changed. But you can't change what you can't see. So before we talk about changing it, you need to see it clearly, all the way down. Not just that the fast bidder wins, but why? What chemical is actually placing that bid? What is happening at the molecular level in the space between the surplus appearing and the decision closing? Because the limbic system doesn't bid with words, it bids with neurochemistry. And once you understand exactly what that neurochemistry is doing to your attention, how it narrows it, sharpens it, points it directly at the thing in front of you while quietly dimming everything else, you stop seeing your financial decisions as choices you're making, and you start seeing them as outcomes you've been assigned. The auction has a chemistry, and that chemistry has a name. Let's go find it. Let's go deeper. Because the phenomenon is visible, but the mechanism is where the real leverage is. When your brain encounters a financial choice, buy now, or save, spend, or invest, take the hit today or protect the future, 2 neurotransmitter systems activate almost simultaneously, and the outcome of that activation determines not just what you decide, but who you become over time. The first system, dopamine. You know this word, but you probably don't know what it actually does. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. That's the popular version. The neuroscientifically accurate version is this. Dopamine is the anticipation chemical. It fires not when you receive a reward, but when your brain predicts one is coming. The moment you see the purchase, the moment you imagine the upgrade, the moment the possibility of immediate gain enters your field of awareness. That's when dopamine surges. Before you've done anything. Before you've decided anything. And here's what that surge does. It narrows attention. Literally. The dopaminergic activation focuses your cognitive resources on the thing in front of you, and this is the critical part. It suppresses activity in the regions responsible for long-term modeling, the very regions that would otherwise be running the calculation about your future self. The reward system doesn't just bid in the auction. It turns off the other auctioneer's microphone. Now the second system, cortisol, the stress hormone, chronically elevated in high performers. In people who carry responsibility, who lead, who operate under sustained pressure. And here is what almost no financial conversation ever mentions. Cortisol directly impairs prefrontal cortex function. Sustained cortisol exposure, not acute stress, but the chronic, low-grade kind that comes with ambitious living, measurably reduces gray matter density in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex over time. This is not temporary impairment. This is structural. The region of your brain most responsible for delayed gratification, for simulating your future self with enough resolution to make it feel real, can actually shrink under prolonged stress. And a smaller, less active prefrontal cortex loses the auction faster. Every time. So the mechanism looks like this. Dopamine narrows present focus and suppresses future simulation. Cortisol degrades the very architecture responsible for resisting that suppression. And the result is a brain that is, in a measurable neurological sense, increasingly present biased with every year of high-pressure living. The harder you've worked, the more you've carried, the more success has cost you in stress, the more your delayed gratification circuitry may have eroded. Not through failure, through the very intensity of your ambition. Let that sit for a moment. There's a third element, and this one is the most underestimated in the literature on wealth behavior. The prefrontal cortex doesn't just calculate, it simulates identity. It runs a model of who you are, who you're becoming, who you'll be in 10 years. And it uses that model to anchor decisions. When the future self-simulation is vivid, specific, emotionally real, it has weight in the present. The future self gets a vote. But when that simulation is vague, abstract, distant, when your future self feels like a stranger, the vote doesn't register. And present, you decides alone. Researchers at UCLA found that people shown images of their age-progressed selves, their actual future faces, allocated significantly more money to retirement funds immediately after. Not because they were convinced by logic, because the future self suddenly had a face, suddenly felt real, suddenly showed up to vote. The mechanism, then, is this. Delayed gratification is not willpower. It is the resolution of your future self-simulation. The more vivid, specific, and emotionally present your future self is, the stronger the prefrontal signal. The stronger the signal, the fairer the auction. The fairer the auction, the more often the builder in you wins. And the error, the one most intelligent people are making right now, is that they are trying to solve a simulation problem with a discipline solution, which is exactly what we need to talk about next. Here is the error, and it's a sophisticated one, which is exactly why it persists in people who are otherwise exceptionally intelligent. The error is this: believing that delayed gratification is a character trait, something you either have or you don't, something built in childhood, tested by marshmallows, confirmed by your report card, your GPA, your early career discipline, a fixed feature of who you are, and therefore, something you either leverage or compensate for, but not something you fundamentally change. This belief is everywhere. It's in the way people talk about themselves. I've never been good with money. I'm a spender, not a saver. I work hard and I like to enjoy what I earn. These aren't confessions, they're identity statements. And identity statements are the most resistant structures in the human brain because they don't feel like beliefs. They feel like facts. And here is why this error is so costly specifically for high achievers. Because high achievers have evidence. They have decades of proof that their discipline works, in their career, in their health, in their relationships. They've built real things. They've delayed real gratifications in real domains. And so the belief calcifies. In the areas where I'm good, and in the areas where I'm not, that's just who I am. The brain accepts this framing completely, because it's partially true, which is the most dangerous kind of error. Here's what the neuroscience actually shows. Delayed gratification circuitry is not a trait. It is a state, a dynamic, context-dependent, trainable pattern of neural activation that fluctuates based on stress levels, sleep quality, environmental cues, identity priming, and, most critically, the vividness of future self-simulation in any given moment. The same person who has iron discipline in their professional decisions can have near-zero delayed gratification capacity in their financial decisions. Not because they're inconsistent, but because the neural conditions that enable prefrontal dominance in one domain are not automatically present in another. Domain specificity. The brain doesn't generalize discipline the way we assume it does. The prefrontal circuits that govern disciplined execution in your professional life are not the same circuits governing your response to a financial surplus at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. And this is where the error compounds. Because when an intelligent person believes delayed gratification is a trait, they attempt to solve the problem with effort, with more willpower, with rules and restrictions and guilt cycles. They white-knuckle their way through financial decisions, exhaust their cognitive resources doing it, and then wonder why it doesn't hold, why the discipline erodes, why the surplus disappears again. They are using a muscle that was never the right tool for the job. Willpower, in the neuroscientific literature, is a resource. It depletes. It is governed by glucose metabolism in the prefrontal cortex, and it is spectacularly unreliable as a long-term strategy for anything, including wealth accumulation, because it requires the very region that's most vulnerable to stress and depletion to be the last line of defense. The people who consistently build, who accumulate across decades, across market cycles, across the chaos of real life, are not running on superior willpower. They are running on superior architecture. Their environment, their identity, their automatic patterns are structured so that the prefrontal cortex doesn't have to fight every battle alone. They've changed the conditions of the auction, not just the bid. And that distinction between effortful resistance and structural recalibration is the entire difference between trying to build wealth and actually building it. But before we get to the blueprint, you need to see what this error looks like from the inside. What it costs. Not in abstract terms. In a life. In a specific, recognizable, uncomfortably familiar life. Because the numbers don't make people change. Stories do. He was 43 years old, living in a suburb of Charlotte, and by every visible measure, he had made it. 14 years building a consulting practice from a spare bedroom into a firm with 11 employees. A house that reflected the work. A car that reflected the position. A lifestyle that, if you'd shown it to him at 26, would have looked like the finish line. He wasn't reckless. That's the important part. He wasn't someone who gambled or spent carelessly or ignored his finances. He thought about money constantly. He tracked income. He knew his numbers. He had a financial advisor he met with twice a year and left feeling vaguely reassured. But there was a pattern, and he couldn't see it because he was inside it. Every time the business had a strong quarter, something happened. Not a crisis, not a collapse. Something quieter, an upgrade, a renovation. A piece of equipment that was genuinely useful, but not genuinely necessary. A trip that was framed as an investment in family connection. A decision that, examined individually, was completely defensible. His advisor would ask about contributions to his retirement account. He would nod and say, "Next quarter." Next quarter became a recurring character in his financial story. Reliable, punctual, always arriving, never staying. At 43, with a business generating real revenue, he had less than 4 months of operating expenses in liquid savings. His retirement account held roughly what a 31-year-old with a mid-level corporate salary might have accumulated on autopilot. He knew this. That's what made it complicated. He wasn't ignorant of the gap. He could calculate the compounding he'd missed. He'd run the numbers himself late at night in the specific silence that follows a long week. And in those moments, something tightened in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. Not quite guilt, not quite fear. Something that lived between the two. And then Monday would come. The business would need something. Or he would. And the moment would close, the calculation would blur, and the week would begin again. What he couldn't see, what no one had ever framed for him in a way that landed, was that he wasn't failing at discipline. He was succeeding at a different optimization. His brain, running the auction it always ran, was consistently choosing the version of the future that felt real over the version that didn't. The renovation felt real. The equipment felt real. The trip felt real. The retirement account at 67 felt like a photograph of a stranger. His future self had no face, no weight, no vote. And so present him decided. Every time. Alone. There was an afternoon, he mentioned this once, to no one in particular, when he sat in his office after everyone had left and looked at the framed photos on the wall. Awards, milestones, a picture from the year the business crossed its first 7 figures. And he felt, underneath the pride, a specific kind of exhaustion. Not burnout. Something quieter. The feeling of having built something real, and somehow still feeling like he was running behind something he couldn't quite name. He didn't know yet that the thing he was chasing wasn't a number. It was a version of himself he had never made vivid enough to feel real. A future self who hadn't been invited into the room where the decisions were made. He would figure that out. But not yet. The cost would have to become visible first. And costs like this, the invisible kind, the compounding kind, have a way of making themselves known in the most inconvenient moments. Not gradually. All at once. In a number on a screen, or a conversation you're not ready for, or a quiet Tuesday when the math finally refuses to stay abstract. That Tuesday was coming. Let's talk about what this actually costs. Not in motivation poster terms. Not in vague warnings about the future. In real, calculable, neurologically explainable numbers. And in something harder to quantify but easier to feel. First, the math. Because the math is brutal when you stop letting it stay abstract. A person who earns well but operates with a present-biased brain, one where the delayed gratification circuitry is consistently losing the auction, doesn't lose money dramatically. They lose it incrementally. In the space between what they could have saved and what they actually saved. In the compounding that never happened. In the positions they never entered because the surplus never survived long enough to be deployed. Researchers who study wealth accumulation patterns consistently find the same asymmetry. The gap between high earners who build lasting wealth and high earners who don't is not explained by income. It is not explained by investment sophistication. The single most predictive variable is the consistency and earliness of savings behavior, not the amount. The consistency, the automaticity. Whether the future self got paid before the present self started spending. A 40-year-old who has been inconsistently saving since 30, always intending to catch up, always finding the next quarter more convenient, is not just behind on a number. They are behind on time. And time, in compounding, is the only input that cannot be purchased retroactively. That is the financial cost. Clean, calculable, final. But there is another cost. And this one doesn't show up in any account statement. It shows up in identity. There is a specific psychological weight that accumulates in people who are outwardly successful but privately aware of the gap between their income and their net worth, between what they project and what they hold. It is not shame exactly. It is something more corrosive than shame because it lacks a clean target. Shame says, I did something wrong. This says, I am somehow wrong. And the brain, unable to locate the specific failure, begins to generate a low-frequency narrative. A story running underneath the visible story. The one that says, You work this hard, you earn this much, and somehow it still isn't building. What does that mean about you? That narrative doesn't announce itself. It operates as a filter. It colors the way ambition feels, less like fuel and more like obligation. It makes success feel like a performance rather than a foundation. And it quietly shapes every financial decision going forward, because the brain that doesn't trust itself around money will find increasingly sophisticated reasons to remain in the pattern it knows. This is the neurological trap at the center of the cost. Present bias doesn't just steal future wealth. It erodes the identity of the builder. And an eroded builder identity makes present bias more likely in the next decision. The cycle self-reinforces. And here is the part that the man in Charlotte was beginning to feel on that quiet Tuesday. The part that no financial advisor had ever named for him. The cost wasn't just the money he hadn't accumulated. The cost was the version of himself he hadn't become. The identity of someone who builds, not just earns, had remained theoretical, aspirational, a character in a future he hadn't made real enough to inhabit. There is research from behavioral economics, specifically from Hal Hirschfield's work at UCLA on future self-continuity, that shows a direct correlation between how connected a person feels to their future self and how much they save. Not how much they intend to save. How much they actually save. The connection to the future self is not a motivational variable. It is a neurological one. A measurable difference in how the brain weights future outcomes against present ones. People with low future self-continuity don't save less because they care less. They save less because their brain is, in a functional sense, making decisions for a stranger. And most people have never been taught to make that stranger feel like family. That changes in the next part of this conversation, because what comes next is not advice. It is architecture. A specific, research-grounded recalibration of the conditions under which your brain makes financial decisions, so that the future self stops being a stranger and starts being the loudest voice in the room. But I want you to understand something before we get there. The blueprint works, not because it requires more discipline from you, but because it requires less. By making the right decision, the one your brain wants to make. By changing the auction itself. And that shift from resistance to architecture is where everything changes. Here is the recalibration. Not a system, not a checklist. A fundamental restructuring of the conditions under which your brain makes financial decisions. 3 layers, each one targeting a different point in the neural mechanism we've been mapping. Layer 1. Future self-resolution. The research is unambiguous. The vividness of your future self-simulation is the primary variable governing delayed gratification capacity. Not willpower, not intention, resolution. So the first intervention is not financial. It is perceptual. You need to make your future self specific, not a number, a person, a day. A Tuesday morning at 61. What does the room look like? What are you not worried about? What decisions did you make in your 40s that you are quietly grateful for right now? Write this, not as a goal, as a memory, in past tense. From the future looking back. This is not journaling as self-help ritual. This is prefrontal activation through prospective memory encoding. When you write your future in past tense, when you describe it as something that already happened, your brain processes it differently than a goal. It assigns it the neural weight of experience rather than aspiration. And experience has a vote in the auction. Aspiration often doesn't. Do this once, specifically, with sensory detail, and revisit it before any significant financial decision. Not to motivate yourself. To populate the room with the person who has the most at stake. Layer 2. Architectural automation. The prefrontal cortex is not a reliable gatekeeper. We established this. It depletes, it gets hijacked by dopamine, it loses the auction when you're tired, stressed, or cognitively loaded. So the blueprint does not ask it to fight every battle. It removes the battle entirely. Automation is not a budgeting tip. It is a neurological bypass. When savings move before you see the surplus, when the architecture of your accounts is designed so that the future self gets paid first, automatically, without requiring a decision, you eliminate the auction. There is no bid. There is no dopamine surge around a surplus that never appears in your spendable environment. The ventral striatum cannot hijack a decision that doesn't exist. This is why the most consistent wealth builders across income levels share one structural trait. They never decide to save. Saving is not a decision they make. It is a condition they've made invisible. The decision was made once, structurally, when the automation was set up. And then it runs without them. Set the automation. Not next quarter. This week. Before the next surplus arrives and the auction reopens. Layer 3. Identity recasting. This is the deepest layer, and the most frequently skipped because it feels less concrete than the others. But the research on identity-based behavior change, particularly James Clear's synthesis of the habit literature and the underlying neuroscience of self-concept, is consistent. Behavior that conflicts with identity is temporary. Behavior that expresses identity is automatic. You cannot sustain the habits of a builder if you hold the identity of an earner. An earner optimizes for income. A builder optimizes for accumulation. These are not the same brain. They do not make the same decisions. They do not respond the same way to a surplus, a windfall, a strong quarter. And the shift between them is not motivational. It is definitional. It happens when you begin to answer the question, who are you with money, with something that precedes behavior rather than following from it. Not, I am trying to save more, but I am someone who builds. And this decision either expresses that or it doesn't. That reframe changes the auction at the identity level, and identity level changes are the most durable the brain produces. If you've stayed with this conversation this far, you already know you're not here for surface answers. You're the kind of person who wants to understand the mechanism, not just the output. That's rare. Subscribe so the next blueprint finds you when it matters. And if this is landing somewhere real, you already know why. Now, let's see what this actually looks like in a life. Not a dramatic transformation. Not a before and after with numbers on a screen. Something quieter. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself. The kind that only becomes visible when you stop and realize that the auction you used to lose every time, you haven't lost it in months. That story is next. She was 51 years old, living outside of Denver, and she had spent the better part of 2 decades being very good at her work and quietly frustrated by what that work had built. Not unhappy. That's an important distinction. She had a life she respected. A career in healthcare administration that had grown steadily, deliberately, into something she was genuinely proud of. A son in college. A home that was hers. A calendar that reflected someone who had earned the right to be busy. But there was a number she avoided looking at directly. The way you avoid a conversation you know is coming. Not with panic. With a kind of practiced peripheral vision that keeps the thing in frame without letting it come into focus. Her retirement account, her savings, the architecture of her future. She wasn't starting from zero, but she was starting from less than she should have been, given everything she had earned, given everything she had built, given the discipline she applied to every other domain of her life. And the gap between what she had and what she should have had, that gap had a sound. Low. Constant. The kind you stop noticing until a quiet moment lets it back in. The shift didn't happen dramatically. It never does, in the lives of people who actually change. It started with a conversation she described as unremarkable. Someone she trusted said something about the difference between earning and building, about how those two identities make different decisions from the same income. She didn't write it down. She didn't act on it that day, but something in the framing didn't dissolve the way most things do. It stayed. Over the following weeks, she did something she later described as almost embarrassing in its simplicity. She wrote a page, not a plan, not a budget, a description of a morning, a specific morning, 10 years from now. What she was doing, what she wasn't carrying, what the previous decade had quietly made possible. She wrote it in past tense, as though it had already happened, as though she were remembering it. She told no one. It felt too private for that, too close to something she wasn't ready to name out loud. But something changed in how financial decisions felt afterward. Not immediately, not completely, gradually. The surplus that used to feel like permission started to feel like material, like something you build with rather than something you release. The distinction was subtle. The effect was not. She set up an automatic transfer the following month. Not a large one, a real one. Sized to what she could sustain, not what she thought she should be doing, and she did not think about it again. That was the point. She had made the decision once, structurally, and then stepped out of the way. 6 months later, she adjusted the amount upward. Not because of discipline, because the identity had quietly shifted underneath the behavior. Because she had started to think of herself, without announcement, as someone who builds. And builders don't debate the transfer. They set the conditions and trust the architecture. What changed wasn't her income. What changed wasn't her intelligence or her work ethic or her access to information. What changed was the resolution of the person she was building toward. That person had become specific, had a morning, had a feeling, had a face close enough to her own that the distance between them collapsed. Her future self had stopped being a stranger. And when the future self stops being a stranger, the auction changes. Not because the limbic system gets quieter, but because the prefrontal cortex finally has someone specific to speak for. She didn't talk about this. There was nothing to announce. The account grew. The low sound faded. Not all at once. In the way that real things change, beneath the surface, before the surface knows. 2 years later, she looked at the number she used to avoid, and held it without flinching. That was the whole transformation. That moment. No milestone. No celebration. Just a woman looking at a number that finally felt like her. Let's talk about what actually changed in her. Not the account, not the behavior. What changed underneath both of those things? Because this is where most conversations about money stop short. They track the external shift and call it transformation. But the external shift is a symptom. What you are really after, what every person in this audience is really after, whether they name it this way or not, is a change in who you are when no one is watching and a financial decision is in front of you. That is an identity question, and identity lives in the brain in a very specific way. The neuroscience of self-concept, the research coming out of places like Stanford's Social Neuroscience Lab and the work of Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan, tells us that identity is not a fixed structure. It is an active, ongoing simulation. Your brain is constantly running a model of who you are, updating it with evidence from your behavior, your environment, your internal narrative. And here is the critical part. That model shapes perception before behavior. You don't act and then decide who you are. You decide who you are, even implicitly, even unconsciously, and then act from that. This is why the identity layer in the blueprint is not supplementary. It is foundational. Because without it, every behavioral intervention becomes a negotiation. Every transfer is a decision. Every surplus is an auction. And auctions, as we've established, are unreliable when the prefrontal cortex is running depleted. But when identity shifts, when the model your brain is running of who you are includes builder at a level below conscious thought, the behavior stops being effortful. It becomes expressive. And expressive behavior doesn't deplete. It compounds. Here is what that integration looks like at the neural level. When you consistently act in alignment with an identity, the brain does something elegant. It begins to encode that behavior as self-relevant. Self-relevant information is processed more deeply, remembered more reliably, and weighted more heavily in future decisions. The brain, in essence, starts to protect the identity by making identity-consistent choices feel natural and identity-inconsistent choices feel wrong. Not wrong as in morally wrong. Wrong as in misaligned. As in, that's not who I am. This is the mechanism behind what people describe as finally clicking. The moment when saving stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like expression. When the automatic transfer stops being a rule you follow and starts being evidence of who you are. That shift is not motivational. It is neurological. The self-concept has updated. The simulation has incorporated new data, and the brain is now defending a different identity than the one it was defending before. But here is what I want you to hold alongside that. This integration is not a destination. It is a practice. The brain's model of self is always being updated by what you do, by what you don't do, by what you tolerate, by what you automate, by how specifically you can describe the person you are becoming. Every financial decision you make from this point forward is either updating the builder identity or eroding it, not dramatically, one data point at a time. And the prefrontal cortex, the region that runs the future self-simulation that gives the builder a voice in the auction, is trainable. Not through willpower, through repetition of identity-consistent behavior in low-stakes moments, through the architectural decisions that make those behaviors automatic, through the vividness practices that keep the future self present and specific and real. The research on neuroplasticity in the prefrontal cortex is among the most hopeful findings in modern neuroscience. This region retains the capacity for structural change, for genuine rewiring, well into midlife and beyond. The circuits that govern delayed gratification are not calcified at 40. They are responsive to environment, to practice, to the quality of the future self-simulation you are running. Which means the conversation we've been having is not about what you should do differently. It is about what you are becoming. Gradually, structurally, below the level where motivation lives and above the level where habits operate. You are becoming someone whose brain runs a different auction. Someone whose future self shows up to vote. With a face, with a morning, with the specific weight of a life that has been made real enough to matter in the present. That is the integration. Not a technique you apply, a person you assemble, one architectural decision at a time, one vivid description at a time, one automatic transfer that happens while you sleep, compounding quietly, expressing an identity that is no longer theoretical. The builder isn't someone you become when the account reaches a certain number. The builder is who you decide you already are, and then act accordingly, until the brain catches up. And it will. We started with a moment you've had, the moment where you knew the right move, where the smarter, longer, quieter play was visible to you, and something else won anyway. I told you that wasn't weakness, that it was a program, a neural architecture running an auction you didn't know was happening in the 3 seconds before what you call a decision. Now you know what's actually in the room when that auction runs. You know about the ventral striatum firing before you've consciously registered the choice. You know about the dopamine narrowing your attention and silencing the prefrontal signal. You know about cortisol quietly eroding the very circuitry that would otherwise defend your future. You know about the future self, the one who has the most at stake in every financial decision you make, showing up without a face, without weight, without a vote. And you know what changes when that changes. Not discipline, architecture, not effort, resolution, not willpower grinding against desire, but a future self so specific, so present, so genuinely real, that the auction finally has 2 real bidders, and the builder in you starts winning, not because you forced it, because you structured for it. This is what the research has been pointing at for decades, while the self-help industry kept selling you harder versions of the same broken tool. More motivation, more rules, more guilt dressed up as accountability, all of it aimed at the wrong variable. The variable was never your commitment. It was your resolution. The variable was never how much you wanted the future. It was how real you had made it. And that single recalibration is the difference between an earner who spends a lifetime building someone else's future and a builder who quietly, structurally, without drama or announcement, assembles their own. One automated transfer at a time. One vivid morning written in past tense. One auction where the future self finally had a seat. Here is what I want to ask you now. Think of 5 people in your life, not the ones who need motivation, but the ones who need the mechanism, the ones who earn well and are quietly frustrated by what it's building, the ones who are smart enough to know the gap is there and haven't yet found the frame that makes it actionable. Send them this, not with a message, just the video. Let the content speak for what you recognized in it. And in the comments, I want to hear something real, not what you thought of the video. What landed? What you're going to do differently this week, specifically. And if there's a topic, a neural mechanism, a behavioral pattern, a financial blind spot that you want mapped next, leave it there. The next blueprint comes from that conversation. Because here is what I know about you, based solely on the fact that you're still here. You are not looking for permission to stay comfortable. You are looking for the architecture to build something that lasts. That's not a common thing. The marshmallow wasn't the test. The test was always whether you could make the future real enough to wait for. You just did.